3 times this summer, the ground threw almost the same punch. 3 times, seismographs on opposite sides of the planet jumped with a violence that could flatten a badly built city in seconds. And 3 times, the number of people who died came back wildly, almost unbelievably different. One of these earthquakes killed about a dozen people. Another killed more than 5,300, and that number is still climbing as I put this together. A third one, powerful enough to send coastal towns running for high ground, killed no one at all. Here's the part that stopped me cold when I lined all 3 up side by side. The earthquake that killed the fewest people was actually the strongest of the 3. Not the weakest, the strongest. So this isn't a story about how big an earthquake was. Big barely matters, it turns out. This is a story about what each place was wearing when the punch landed. And by the end of the next 20 minutes or so, you're going to understand exactly why 2 towns can take nearly the same blow, and one buries a dozen while the other buries thousands. You'll also understand which of those 2 categories most American cities actually fall into, because that answer might not be the one you expect. If you want the honest version of stories like this, the packaging without the panic, the real data instead of the doomsday cartoon, go ahead and subscribe now, because we do this the same way every single day. Let me show you the 3 earthquakes. Start with the strongest one, the one that should have been the massacre and wasn't. On the morning of June 8th, 2026, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake tore open the seafloor off the southern Philippines, off the coast near Sarangani, in the waters below Mindanao. 7.8. Sit with that number for a moment, because on the scale we use for earthquakes, that is enormous. It's in the same neighborhood as the quake that leveled parts of Turkey and Syria a few years back and killed tens of thousands. It is far bigger than the other 2 you're about to meet, and when it was over, the confirmed death toll was around a dozen people. How? How does the single most powerful earthquake of the summer, a genuine monster, kill fewer people than a bad highway pileup? The first answer is where it happened. The energy didn't rip loose directly under a crowded city. It released offshore, out under the ocean, and that distance matters enormously. Think of the punch again. A punch thrown from across the room is not the same as a punch thrown from 6 inches away. By the time all that seismic energy traveled up through miles of rock and seawater and finally reached the towns on shore, a good part of its force had already bled off along the way. It arrived strong. It did not arrive at full strength. The second answer is that the Philippines has been rehearsing for this its entire modern history. This is a country that sits directly on the Ring of Fire, the horseshoe of grinding plate boundaries that circles the Pacific. Filipinos get earthquakes the way other places get thunderstorms. So the country runs a serious monitoring agency. Its seismologists watch the ocean floor constantly, and within minutes of the shaking, they pushed out a tsunami warning for the coast. People near the water knew to move to higher ground, and many of them did exactly that. A wave did come. It was measured off the coast. But it hit a population that had already been told to get away from the shoreline. Now, a dozen deaths is still a dozen families whose lives were split in half on a Monday morning, and hundreds more were injured, and buildings did come down. This was not a non-event. But hold the scale in your mind. The biggest earthquake of the 3, the one with the most raw power by a wide margin, produced the smallest loss of life by an even wider margin. That is not luck. That is a place that was, in a very real sense, wearing armor when the punch came and standing far enough back that the punch was already tired when it got there. Before we go on, I want to be straight with you about that word strongest, because it's about to matter a lot. I've been saying these 3 earthquakes threw almost the same punch, and in the headlines they look almost identical. 7.8, 7.5, 7.3. Those numbers sit so close together on the page that they feel interchangeable. They are not. The scale we use is sneaky. Every single step up isn't a small bump, it's a leap. A 7.8 doesn't release a little more energy than a 7.3. it releases something like 10 to 15 times more energy. The Philippines quake was, in pure force, in a completely different weight class from the other two. It was the heavyweight of the summer, no contest. So keep that in your back pocket, because it makes what happened next even stranger. If death tolls tracked raw power, the Philippines should have been the catastrophe and the others should have been footnotes. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The heavyweight barely left a mark, and a genuinely smaller quake, one that released a fraction of that energy, became one of the deadliest disasters this hemisphere has seen in a generation. That's the one we have to talk about now. On the evening of June 24th, 2026, at about 6:05 in the evening local time, northern Venezuela was hit not once but twice. First a magnitude 7.2, then 39 seconds later, a magnitude 7.5. 39 seconds. Barely enough time to realize the first one had stopped before the bigger one started. The epicenter sat in a rural municipality west of the city of San Felipe, but the destruction reached straight into the heart of the country, into Caracas, and, worst of all, into the coastal state of La Guaira. Everything that had protected the Philippines was missing here. Start with depth. The Venezuela main shock broke at roughly 10 kilometers down. That's about 6 miles. In earthquake terms, that's shallow. That's the punch thrown from 6 inches away, not across the room. There was almost no distance for the energy to lose itself in. It came up out of the ground with nearly all its force intact, right underneath where people were sitting down to dinner. Then there's location. This wasn't out under the ocean. It was under land, under homes, under apartment blocks and hillside neighborhoods. The full force landed on the exact places where human beings live. And then there's the armor, or the terrible lack of it. In parts of La Guaira, according to officials surveying the wreckage, something like 80% of the buildings came down. 80%. Picture your own street, and picture 8 out of every 10 houses on it collapsing into the road in under a minute. Many of these structures were built cheaply, built into unstable hillsides, built without the kind of steel reinforcement that lets a wall flex instead of shatter. When the shaking hit, they didn't sway, they pancaked. The numbers that came out of Venezuela climbed in a way that is genuinely hard to sit with. In the first hours, officials spoke of a couple hundred dead. Within a week, that figure had passed 2,200. By early July, it was more than 3,500. And the most recent counts I could confirm put it above 5,300 killed, with more than 16,700 injured and tens of thousands of people left with no home to go back to. The financial damage alone has been estimated at around $6.7 billion. The forecasting system the United States Geological Survey uses to predict casualties through its highest level alert, a red alert, within minutes, essentially warning that mass casualties were not just possible but likely. There's one more piece that made Venezuela worse, and it has nothing to do with geology. Venezuela has one of the most tightly controlled information environments on Earth. In the hours after the quake, more than 200 websites in the country were reportedly blocked, including news sites and the tools people use to get around censorship. When you can't get accurate information out, families can't find each other, aid is slower to target the worst hit blocks, and the true scale takes longer to even become visible. Darkness costs lives too. This was the smaller earthquake. Remember that. A quake that released a fraction of the Philippines' energy killed hundreds of times more people because it landed close, it landed shallow, it landed on land, and it landed on a place with almost nothing to absorb the blow. Quick one for you before the third quake, because I'm curious. Of the 3 things that decide whether an earthquake kills, the depth, the distance, or the way the buildings were built, which one surprises you most as the real deciding factor? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and the answers on these always split people right down the middle. Now the third earthquake, the one almost nobody outside the region even heard about, which is the whole point. On July 17th, 2026, a magnitude 7.3 struck off Mexico's southern Pacific coast, near the border with Guatemala, off the coast of Chiapas. It rattled a huge region. People felt it from southern Mexico into Guatemala and El Salvador. Authorities issued tsunami caution and told people to stay off the beaches. Aftershocks rolled through the morning. The death toll from that magnitude 7.3 earthquake was 0. 2 people were injured. That's it. And by now you can probably read the reasons yourself, which means the story is starting to make sense, which is exactly what I wanted. It was offshore, so the punch had distance to travel and lost some of its force on the way. It broke at around 15 kilometers down, deeper than Venezuela's, another buffer. But there's a third reason, and it's the most important one, because it's the one humans actually control. Mexico paid for its armor in blood decades ago. In 1985, a massive earthquake struck Mexico City and killed something on the order of 10,000 people. It was a national trauma, and it became a turning point. In the years after, Mexico completely overhauled how it builds. It rewrote its construction codes. It built one of the most advanced earthquake early warning systems in the entire world, a network that can detect a quake at its source and send an alarm racing ahead of the shaking, buying people precious seconds to get away from windows, out of buildings, off the road. So when the ground moved on July 17th, Mexico met that punch-wearing armor it had spent 40 years forging out of an old catastrophe. Same kind of blow that devastated Venezuela. Almost no one hurt. 3 earthquakes, 1 summer, about 6 weeks from the first to the last. And if you just read the magnitudes off a chart, you'd guess the Philippines was the horror and the other 2 were minor. The truth ran completely backwards. The strongest killed about a dozen. The middle one killed thousands. The one people barely noticed killed no one. Now I need to stop and answer the question I know some of you have been holding since the beginning, because if I don't, I'm no better than the channels that feed you a cartoon. 3 enormous earthquakes in 6 weeks. Are they connected? Is the planet doing something? Is this the beginning of the big one? The sign that the Earth is somehow waking up? Here is the honest answer, and I want you to hear the whole thing. No. These 3 quakes are not connected to each other. They happened on completely different fault systems, on different tectonic plates, thousands of miles apart, driven by their own separate local stresses that have been building for centuries. An earthquake in the Philippines does not reach across the Pacific and squeeze a fault in Venezuela. The physics simply doesn't work that way. The stresses that trigger one quake fade out within a few fault lengths of where it happened. They do not travel between continents. And clusters like this, 3 big ones close together in time, are far more normal than they feel. The planet averages somewhere around 15 to 20 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater every single year. Do the math on that. 15 or more heavyweight quakes a year means it is completely ordinary for 2 or 3 of them to land within a 6-week window somewhere on Earth. It only feels like a pattern because they were all big enough to make the news at once, and because our brains are wired to see faces in clouds and plots and coincidences. This one is a coincidence. A tragic one, but a coincidence. So then why does it feel like earthquakes are getting more common and more deadly? That's the part where something real actually has changed, and it's not the geology, it's us. There are more than 8 billion people on this planet now, and more of them than ever are packed into fast-growing cities that sit right on top of active faults, often in buildings thrown up quickly and cheaply to house everyone. The Earth isn't shaking more. There are just far more of us standing in the way when it does. The hazard is roughly constant. The exposure has exploded. Which brings us to the one sentence that this entire story has been building toward, and I'd ask you to actually stop and let it land. The death toll of an earthquake is not decided by the earthquake. It's decided by a geological event colliding with a set of human choices that were made long before the ground ever moved. The magnitude is nature's part. Everything else, how deep it broke, how far away, and above all what we built and how we built it, decides whether a community loses a dozen people or 5,000. And if you're sitting in the United States listening to this, that equation is not academic, it's personal. Because here's the uncomfortable question. When your part of the country takes its punch, and parts of it will, which of these three stories are you living in? Are you the Philippines, far back and armored? Are you Mexico, protected by hard lessons already paid for? Or are you closer to Venezuela than you'd like to admit? The honest answer is that America is a patchwork. In California, decades of strict building codes and retrofitting mean many structures are engineered to ride out serious shaking. That's armor, real armor, built the same way Mexico built its own. But look at the Pacific Northwest, at the Cascadia Fault offshore of Oregon and Washington, capable of a genuine giant, where a lot of older buildings and infrastructure were simply never designed for the quake the geology says is coming. Look at the New Madrid zone in the middle of the country, around the Mississippi Valley, where a major quake in the 1800s rang church bells hundreds of miles away, and where very few people today build as if it could ever happen again. Those places have thinner armor. The punch, when it comes, will find it. So what do you actually do with all this? Sitting at your kitchen table. Not panic. The other direction. You do the small, boring, unglamorous things that are the human half of that equation, the half you personally control. You find out, honestly, whether your home is bolted to its foundation, because a house that isn't can slide off it in strong shaking, and that's often a fixable problem. You strap down the water heater, you move the heavy things off the high shelves above the beds, you keep a few days of water and supplies because after any major quake, the help does not arrive in the first hour. And you settle in advance on where your family meets and how you reach each other when the phones are jammed. Because in Venezuela, the silence itself became part of the tragedy. None of that is dramatic. None of it makes a good thumbnail. But it is, quite literally, the difference between the towns that lost a dozen and the towns that lost thousands. It is you choosing which of these three stories your own household gets to live in. Let me leave you where this actually stands tonight, because it isn't finished. In Venezuela, the number is still moving. The count of the dead climbed for weeks, from hundreds to thousands to more than 5,300, and tens of thousands of people are still listed as missing, still unaccounted for under rubble that recovery crews are only now reaching. That final number, when it settles, is going to be the real measure of what a shallow quake does to a place with no armor. We'll keep tracking it here as it becomes clear, because that number deserves to be witnessed accurately, not sensationalized and not forgotten. So subscribe and turn on the bell, because when that final Venezuela toll is confirmed, and when the next one of these hits, and there will be a next one, you'll already understand exactly what you're looking at, while everyone else is still asking whether the world is ending. It isn't. It's just doing what it's always done. The only thing that ever really changes is how ready we chose to be.